Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another video. Today it is already the 31st of December in Ukraine and Russia. So let's get into the very important developments. I'm going to zoom in and discuss Russian advances throughout the Andriivka, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar fronts. We'll finish off with Terny. I also want to discuss the new aid package that was announced by President Biden today. We'll look at some of the reasons behind the decline in CAB slash FAB and Shahid drone fire reported by the Ukrainian side on a day-to-day basis. And there's also a new Ukraine brigade that was formed earlier today. I want to look at its presence and location before we get into the actual frontline dynamics, and everything is timestamped for you guys. So let's zoom in over here and click on the new unit that has been formed, the 40th Coastal Defense Brigade. It is currently being deployed in Kherson, which is understandable because, first of all, it is a part of the 30th Marine Corps, which is now a huge umbrella organization for a lot of Ukrainian units, not just Marine units, but several territorial defense brigades, and also the Birds of Magyar FPV unit. So it is really beginning to expand, and this unit is going to be disconnected from most of the other Marine brigades because the Marine brigades, for the most part, are located in Donetsk, and you also have one of them operating in Kursk. But for now, they're going to get their combat experience over here and may actually have some sort of capacity where they are acting as Marines, not just as ground soldiers. So they already released some promo videos with FPV strikes onto small boats. So just know of their presence, and I will keep an eye on them to see if they eventually get redeployed to fight somewhere else besides Kherson. But let's zoom in and begin to look at the Russian advances along the northern bank of the Sukhyali River. So here you can see Russian advances amounting to 7.26 square kilometers. This is due to the Russian capture of Uspennivka. It unlocked a new linchpin through which they could launch armored assaults, because now we're seeing the Russians reintroduce armored vehicles and columns into this region after several months of, you could say, a bit of a decrease in the volume of Russian vehicular assaults, because for a very long time, the Russian brigades operating over here were focused on very, very specific fighting in house-to-house combats. And so it wasn't as relevant to send in armored vehicles across open fields to overrun, say, Ukrainian trenches, because the fighting was occurring house-to-house in areas like Yelizavetivka, Romanivka, etc. But now you have this sort of large gap in between the line of contact and where the Ukrainians are now positioned. You could see that before the Russian advance, it was amounting to something like 5 kilometers, and so Uspennivka has turned into a new forward hub for Russian deployment. On December 29th, Ukraine's 37th Mechanized Marine Brigade, reported on 4 armored personnel carriers and 1 Russian tank advancing from Uspennivka along paved roads north of the Sukhyali River towards Terny. They were met by FPV strikes, especially after some of those vehicles were abandoned, and a lot of them did have a lot of protection on the top and on the sides, but regardless, they were still abandoned after the infantry dismounted. The soldiers were not able to make it to the village itself because they were spotted by Ukrainian reconnaissance beforehand. And you can see that the Russians right now, their maximum gain is about 1.5 kilometers away from said village. So they do still have to work on advancing further. But for now, they have been able to situate themselves in this forested patch and in some of the Ukrainian fortifications north of the river. And this is where the Russian forces were targeted by Ukrainian drone drops. They dropped grenades onto their positions. And the Russians now are also pretty close to this water treatment facility where there are also some pre-prepared Ukrainian positions. But again, it is an important gain that allows the Russians to further create a buffer around their Uspennivka positions and get closer to the 2015 trenches that are supposed to protect the southern flank of what remains of Ukraine's Kurakhove bastion. You can see over here the Russian forces have also consolidated control over some of the open fields, tree lines, and trenches that are a bit further to the east. It amounts to 0.8 square kilometers of territory captured. And then in Kurakhove itself, this is important. There are reports from the Ukrainian side that over the past 2 days, there has been a complete withdrawal of their forces from the Pivdenia micro-district, which is one of the final areas where there actually was Ukrainian resistance in a residential setting in the city. So we do have a geolocation from December 30th of the 110th Brigade, which is very active around here. They've done a lot of work recently with the western citadel of the city, and they probably were just recently moved southwards to push out the remnants of the 46th Air Assault Brigade from this location, and they raised their flag up on one of the higher rises. And so it appears that Besides this yellow polygon, there may be a few other buildings over here that have recently been taken over by the Russians. I'm just waiting for final confirmation, even though Ukrainian Telegram channels have been discussing it. Now, to look a bit further to the west, the Russian forces have already made forays into the areas near the thermal power plant and some of the other mechanical facilities. There's two large mechanical plants past the thermal power plants that the Ukrainians are building upon right now. So here you can see December 29th. The Molot units of the 46th Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers crossing through these gardens into the Garage Cooperative. You could see it over here. This entails a capture of the yellow polygon, and if we're going to measure it, you'll see they are only a couple hundred meters away from the thermal power plant itself, where the Ukrainians are digging in mainly with elements of the 46th, but there may be some involvement of the 79th. That's something that has to be determined. But again, you can see how now the Russians are working and consolidating their holdings in Kurakhove. Most of the city has not been decimated. Most of the high rises are, at least in terms of their skeletal structure, intact, making them really good positions to overlook the surrounding regions. Because you look at it, you look at the elevation, starting out with the thermal power plants, moving all the way to the Vovcha River Valley, and it is relatively low in elevation. There are two areas that the Ukrainians have a bit of a silver lining in. There are two ridges that sort of run in between this low-lying valley that I'm sort of squiggling over here. And those are the only two ridges that the Ukrainians still have control over in this entire sector. And when I refer to the sector, I'm talking about this pocket that I'm going over with this red perimeter right now. Besides that, all of the areas under Ukrainian control are on extremely low elevation. As you can see, it's mainly focused around two river valleys, Sukhiali and Vovcha, and so that is completely understandable. But the Russian forces, on the other hand, do have a significant elevation advantage. And at the same time, they're targeting Ukrainian positions and vehicles in areas that are pretty close to the front line. So, for instance, a French AMX armored vehicle was destroyed by a Russian ATGM fire just north of Sukhiali earlier today. So, just keep that in mind. At the same time, the Russian forces have expanded along this horizontal paved road from Stary Terny into Shevchenko. So they've entered the village for the first time now. It's amounting to zero point 0.6 square kilometers of additional territory captured. And it is very important when you think about it, because imagine being able to just pierce through, crossing over the Solana River, and getting control over entirety of Shevchenko. What that would entail is that the Russian forces would be only, say, 3 kilometers away from Andriivka, and there would be no village in between. Of course, the attack vector would be very thin, and it would sort of be this unexpected and unconventional foray deep into enemy lines. But regardless, it would be way too close for comfort for the Ukrainian forces that are currently withdrawing continuously back towards the Andriivka region, and that would be something very bad for Ukraine's cohesion, which is already difficult due to continuous withdrawals and pockets forming. Another area where this could really brew and begin to manifest in the coming months is where the Russians are currently advancing, and that would be Novoyelizavetivka. So the Russians here advanced 2.8 square kilometers. There's a few geolocations from here. I didn't get the video for this because the video was privated from the Facebook account of the 151st Mechanized Brigade, but it's just standard compilation video, probably of FEV strikes onto Russian soldiers as they dismounted into Novoyelizavetivka. So, in relatively quick fashion, the Russians have taken over this village. They did so in a two-pronged attack. First of all, through Novoyelivka, they were able to reach this paved road, directly enter from there. There were a couple of clashes, but then you had this northern hook come in, which allowed the Russians to flank the Ukrainians. And again, the issue for the Ukrainians is that this village really is small in surface area. There's not much to defend and hold on to. The houses get quickly destroyed. You can't stay in the basements as they get overrun. And so inevitably, you have to run back to an area like an Andriivka. And it's not as if the Ukrainians can concentrate all their fire on a single vector, because all of these villages are surrounded by just huge swaths of open fields in all directions. So if the Russians are unable to break through the Ukrainian entrance points and get into the villages through the eastern direction, they can very easily swirl around and put pressure from the north or from the south with very little contention, very little static defenses or mines or anything to really be concerned about. And then you have a foothold in the village, which is pretty small. And it's all about retaining that and then expanding further. So that's definitely an issue that has no easy solutions in this region because of the way in which the towns are built, the way in which the surrounding region is sort of situated. And when it comes to elevation, the Ukrainians do have silver lining over here. You could see that there is a relatively large ridge that is just south of Nadivka, and it runs all the way to the next chain of villages, which you see over here. Troitske, Bohdanivka, Zaporizhia, all those villages, they are located on a valley. It's understandable. It's done intentionally when the settlements are formed. But then the area in between, it's on a hill. It's a relatively large hill, which gives the Ukrainians a good vantage point as the Russians advance from village to village a bit to the north. But on the other end, the Russians also have relatively large elevated areas under their control. This entire region that is located, say, east, or I should say west of Selidove and then south of Novochortska, is really on a massive ridge, and the Russians, as a result, have a massive elevation point, vantage point overlooking much of the border region between Dnipro and Donetsk. So that is important, very, very important looking forward. And again, remember this area, this large swath of open space that is located between the Vovcha River Valley and some of the final Ukrainian villages before reaching Dnipro Oblast. This area is also on relatively high elevation, but it's not that big of an advantage if it's not utilized. And right now, I just haven't seen enough signs of the Ukrainians building up over here. So that's going to be a really important task for them in the coming months. Now, to look a bit to the north, there is a slight Russian advance indicating their entrance into Novovasilivka, where again, the density of settlements is a bit larger. And this is a place where you have a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements. So the pace of the advances is dying down a little bit over here. And you do have pushback from the 33rd Assault Battalion, for instance, and 25th Air Assault Brigade. Looking a bit to the north, the Russians were able to take Volkove. This was mentioned by Deep State, but also by other Ukrainian Telegram channels. Here you have a video from the 155th Mechanized Brigade. It's a sort of long video, but it just goes over the ways in which they were able to spot Russian infantry advance along this particular tree line, and then sent in their own ground soldiers, drones, shelling, bombs fire, and were able to eliminate some of the Russian soldiers that were advancing along this route. But it's also pretty much a confirmation of my previous marking of the line of contact. So really not much has changed, just that the Ukrainians are pretty active on the defense here. And that is completely understandable because right now the Russians are at the precipice of this massive ridge, this ridge that runs all along the rail line feeding into Pokrovsk. And Vovkove was one of the final villages before really arriving at a destination. So now it's only a matter of a couple of kilometers through open fields before the Russians actually reach this location and cut off a key supply routes. So the Ukrainians are now putting in a lot of resources into defending this specific axis. But as you zoom in, you can see Pischana is also remaining an area of interest for both sides. Here you can see December 29th, the Dovbush unit of the 68th Air Brigade, they dropped a grenade from a drone onto a Russian soldier that was he was hiding under an armored vehicle, and this indicated a minor advance through the Pischana industrial zone. You also had a Ukrainian localized counterattack. You could see that in the process, they are able to retake a portion of this tree line east of Pischane. Here you can see on December 29th, the 425th Skala Battalion, they utilized an M113 armored vehicle. They dismounted about 6 troops and were able to take 8 Russian soldiers POW during the course of the combat. So this is just going to be a minor improvement for the local Ukrainian garrison. You can see that east of Shevchenko, the Russians have been able to advance along this rail line. Ironically, they are advancing through the one area that is actually on low elevation in this region because they're doing so along the Soloniki River. It amounts to about 40 hectares of territory being captured, but it is an important route. You can see that in total, it's about 800 meters of territory northwards, and it is along a predefined route because you have the red line and the windbreaks, and you could see how it is very clearly paved in a direction that would lead into the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. So it's a region that could be easily exploited by Russian infantry that have a lot of experience in advancing through tree lines and a lot of dense shrubbery. And also it's an area that lacks in the really well-built trenches that you see built elsewhere, especially on the eastern approaches to Pokrovsk. But I will say that the satellite imagery over here is not up to date. There is probably more Ukrainian buildings. And when I say that, I mean defensive works such as trenches, anti-tank ditches, and mines, which you can't really see over here, but also dragon's teeth that are placed along the southern flank. It's definitely the case, but it's just that this is a snippet of some of the defenses built by the Ukrainians, regardless of the exact amount, which I have to look at the updates when it comes to tracking them. It's definitely not the same in terms of quality or quantity as this eastern flank, which is a part of why the Russians are having success over here. Now, looking a bit to the east, at the Chensky region, the Russians have been able to expand past the village after taking it over this past week. You could see here, this is a video from the 1st Battalion of the 68th Jaeger Brigade. They just conducted grenade drops onto Russian soldiers entering into western Lysivka, because for a very long time now, the Russians have been trying to take over the village in its entirety. The Ukrainians have resisted because it's one of the final villages south of the several rings of trench perimeters before Pokrovsk itself, so it served as like a forward Ukrainian outcropping. And the eastern approach was like a very uniform, sort of unitary route of attack, and it became predictable. And the Ukrainians were used to repelling those assaults. And so, with the fall of the Chenska, the Russians had an opportunity to put pressure from the western flank. You could see how it has now been successful because the Russians were able to advance about 800 meters northwards, cut off the road that connects Lysivka to Jelena, and Jelena now is in a difficult situation because on both sides it is being enveloped. And again, the Russian forces took over some positions near the E50 highway, and they are approaching some of the 2015 era trenches built by the Ukrainian side. And those are really well built in comparison to the ones that were built over the past year or two. And then you have access to the highway leading directly into southern outskirts of Pokrovsk as well. So very important area for the Ukrainians to defend. Another update which I found interesting is in relation to Vozhvizhenko, an area that really has not changed much. You can see that I suppose the most recent Russian gain here was 2 months ago when they raised their flag in the southern portion of the village, near one of the local strongholds at the entrance to the village. And since then, just the clashes died down. The Russian attention was moved elsewhere because really, a lot of the objectives in relation to reaching Vodvizhenko was to cut off the supply route into Pokrovsk, but it reached a point where the Russians were already undermining its southern flank and getting very close to the city from another direction. So it wasn't as relevant to, have these broad tactical maneuvers like 20 kilometers east of the city in order to influence the course of the battle. So you just had a lot of troops rotated out. Another issue is that the Ukrainians have a large elevation advantage in the area between the line of contact, because the line of contact is basically separated by some shallow streams or ponds, reservoirs, whatever it may be, and then the highway. And the area in between this area in the red perimeter is on a relatively high elevation, and it's a region that, a pretty sizable Ukrainian garrison has been able to maintain cohesion over for an extended period of time. But all that being said, the Russian forces have now been able to gain additional territory per deep state. You can see here nearly 1 square kilometer of territory being captured south of the city, and then here 35 hectares. So again, just an improvement of the positions, but it's reached a point where, due to this infiltration to the southern portion of the village, it may fall in its entirety. And we'll have to see if it's a part of a broader maneuver or if it was just a sort of positional advance. Now, when it comes to the Toretsk and New York fronts, you can see something very interesting that has continued to appear in the village of Shcherbynivka. So, almost all maps and sources don't really say that this village is in a gray zone or under, total Russian assault on a regular basis. But based on the geolocated footage that I've seen recently, and it's dated to, the past day or two, you actually have very, very deep Russian infiltrations, which could have implications for the entirety of this front. And so I'm going to be a bit cautious about, making any significant changes just yet, but I might do it tomorrow if things continue in this trajectory. So let me elaborate. So you have videos of 3 BMPs and infantry dismounting in the village of Shcherbynivka, and they're targeted by Ukrainian FPVs and tanks as well that fire towards the houses in which those Russian soldiers are located. That all definitely occurred, but we're just seeing an uptick in the amount of videos of Russian armored vehicles, because this is one of the areas where armored columns are the most frequently used. They continue to come in from the Nilipivka region, which now Deep State has admitted is under Russian control, and they're able to infiltrate really deep past the line of contact that we imagine to be true. You could say at a distance of 2.5 kilometers, and then actually have now succeeded in dismounting soldiers in the village itself. And in most cases where something like this happens elsewhere, I change the location of the front line to show that the Russians entered those regions and have control. This area is a bit different because a couple of times we've seen the Russians advance with armored vehicles and then get pushed back. It's happened actually a handful of times, but this case, we're actually seeing infantry dismount, and that's a bit of a difference. It's not just vehicles getting destroyed. And so I'm deliberating as to whether to change the front line substantially and then show that you have this very deep Russian infiltration point, which would really entail the complete fall of any remaining Ukrainian troops in this trench region south of the landfill and in whatever's left of their possession in Zabalka. And what that would mean is a strengthening of the front line for the Russian side, and it would look something like this. It would entail the capture of all of this rail line region all the way up to Shcherbynivka, and then also this connection with the landfill and everything south of it. That would be a very, very strong vector of advance. It would eliminate a massive Ukrainian pocket of resistance and then have implications for Toretsk itself and for the villages along the Kryvyi Toretsk River. Really would be a massive tactical advantage for the Russian side. And so something to really keep an eye on is whether the Russians were able to capitalize on those advances, get full control over Shcherbynivka. I do think it's very interesting that they've been able to infiltrate the Ukrainian line. It's not something that you see every day in this region. But over here, you can see that the Zabalka district is continuing to fall into Russian hands. In this case, zero point 0.5 square kilometers of houses have fallen into Russian control, and they're clearing out the remaining portions of the district in its entirety. A bit to the north, we have another geolocation. This is from the Predator Police Brigade, one of the most active Ukrainian units in this region. So they just conducted FPV strikes or grenade drops onto Russian soldiers. This is an area where you don't see any vehicular assaults, which is obviously the case because it's in an urban setting. It's mainly soldiers on foot. And you also have a really high amount of documented casualties as a result because, the fighting is going on in very specific areas where drones are very active. And so they film it. And you could see that over here with the Russian soldiers entering the Fomicha micro district. And they got close to this local school. And actually, when you look at the advance, it amounts to, let's see, with the Sail Polygon, about 600 meters, which is pretty much a substantial advance in the context of, a urban battle, and the Russians are only about 200 300 meters away from landfill number 10, one of the local strongholds and vantage points that the Ukrainians still control. Obviously the major ones are now in Russian hands, but some of the ones that are closer to the battlefield are still being utilized by the Ukrainians, obviously not consistently because they're so close to the front line, but you have one, two, three, four of them that still have to be taken over by the Russians. When it comes to Chasiv Yar, you have here the Russian forces engaging in heavy clashes with the Ukrainians near the refractory plant. A lot of Ukrainian sources now claim that since the 15th of December, there have been counter-attacking activities by the 24th and 56th Mechanized Brigades, and that they've been able to push the Russians out of the refractory plant in its entirety. At the very least, the Ukrainians retain control over more than half of it, and the Russian pace of advances by the 98th VDV division has really just come to a halt. You could see here that the Ukrainians did succeed in this localized counterattack in an area south of the Novi district, and this is in a residential area. So you have here a geolocation from December 30th of an FPV strike by the VDV onto a newly taken Ukrainian house in Chasiv Yar. So that's indicative of the Ukrainians improving their local positions. But really, besides that, the fighting has really stagnated with the Ukrainians maintaining control over the core of the city. Looking to the north, this is an area where the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade has been very active. They took over the village of Andriivka per Ukrainian sources as well. This was one of the final villages in the Chasiv Yar sort of region and its surroundings that was under Ukrainian control east of the canal. Now it is under, of course, Russian possession, meaning that there is the possibility of sort of strengthening and equalizing the front line, taking over these areas, open fields, and forested regions that really can no longer be held by an overstretched Ukrainian force. And that would have, of course, some implications from Orikhovo Vasilivka, and maybe there is now a possibility of crossing over the canal north of Chasiv Yar, which would have implications for the urban battle, which is stalemated in whenever the Russians try to advance directly from the east. And now, in regard to Terny, the Russians have taken it over fully. You can see here that the capture amounts to 1 square kilometer. Here, this is from the 68th Mechanized Brigade. They had a tank deployed that fired towards the advancing Russian forces. They targeted 3 BMPs, Ukrainian FPVs, and they hit them successfully. But regardless of the Ukrainian defensive efforts, the geolocations of BMPs really advancing through the center of the village and then southwards, and troops dismounting and entering into houses, that's pretty good confirmation that the Russian forces have taken it over. And in addition, most of the possessions east of it. There's a bit of ambiguity as to whether they took over this forested region. This is an area where Ukrainian infantry could resist in small quantities, so we're going to have to wait and see if that's actually the case. But for the most part, the garrisons here are withdrawn to Yampolivka, which is similar in its framework and build as to Terny, in the sense that it is a very narrow village from north to south. But in this case, it's actually pretty small, and so it's going to be even harder for the Ukrainians to defend here, but it is absolutely necessary because after Yampolivka, you have just this open road all the way to the final Ukrainian possessions that are actually, houses, basements, structures east of the Zherbets River. So it's going to be very critical for the front line to sort of be held at this position in Yampolivka. So keep an eye out for what the Russians do if they try to now increase the tempo as a result of their